Welcome to the channel. Tonight's story is not just about survival, it's about isolation, fear, and a child the world forgot. In 1879, a black boy named William Robinson vanished into a remote forest and was believed dead, yet he survived 1,000 days completely alone, with no shelter, no protection, and no one coming to save him. William Robinson was born into a world that had technically ended slavery, but in reality, freedom for black families in the late 1870s was fragile, dangerous, and often an illusion. Reconstruction was collapsing. Laws meant to protect formerly enslaved people were being ignored, and racial violence was quietly becoming a tool of control. For black children like William, childhood was short, uncertain, and rarely safe. Historical records suggest William was born to a poor black family living on the edges of rural society, likely working land they did not own. Education, if it existed at all, was informal, passed through stories, survival habits, and observation rather than books. Children were expected to work early, gathering wood, tending animals, or assisting adults just to keep the family alive. Hunger was common. Protection was not guaranteed. William grew up learning the rhythms of nature before he ever understood the laws of men. He knew how to recognize animal tracks, how weather changed the forest, and which plants were safe to touch. These lessons were not taught for adventure. They were taught because stepping into the woods was sometimes safer than staying near people who viewed black lives as disposable. Despite his young age, William was described as quiet and observant, a child who listened more than he spoke. Some neighbors later recalled that he seemed unusually comfortable near the tree line, often wandering just far enough to vanish from sight. At the time, no one thought much of it. Children disappearing for hours was not uncommon, and black children especially were rarely watched closely by authorities. This neglect would soon become critical. When William vanished in 1879, there was no organized search, no urgent alarm, and no official concern. His early life, marked by poverty, racial invisibility, and forced independence, had unknowingly prepared him for what was coming. The very skills meant to help him survive daily hardship would soon become the difference between life and death. And when the forest finally swallowed him, the world barely noticed. In the summer of 1879, William Robinson vanished without warning. There were no witnesses, no clear signs of a struggle, and no official record explaining where he went or why. One day he was simply gone. In an era when black lives were rarely documented with care, his disappearance slipped into silence almost immediately. According to fragmented local accounts, William had been sent on a routine errand near the edge of the forest, perhaps to gather wood, check traps, or deliver something to a nearby homestead. These tasks were common for children, especially in rural communities where survival depended on constant labor. What made this day different was that William never came back. At first, some assumed he had wandered too far and would return by nightfall. When darkness fell and he didn't appear, concern rose, but only briefly. No formal search party was organized. Local authorities showed little interest, and neighbors hesitated to enter the forest, which had a reputation for being dense, disorienting, and dangerous even for adults. Rumors quickly replaced facts. Some whispered that William had been taken by wild animals. Others claimed he had run away, though no one could explain why a child with no resources would choose the wilderness over the brutal certainty of poverty. A few darker rumors suggested human involvement, but without witnesses, those suspicions were never spoken openly. Within days, the search, if it could be called that, ended. William was quietly assumed dead. His name faded from conversation, and life continued as it always had. No marker was placed. No report was filed. History moved on. What no one realized was that while the world believed William Robinson had disappeared forever, he was still alive, alone, frightened, and stepping deeper into a forest that would become both his prison and his only protection for the next 1,000 days. The forest that swallowed William Robinson was not an ordinary stretch of trees. It was a place locals avoided, a wilderness spoken about in lowered voices. Dense, sprawling, and largely unmapped, it stretched for miles beyond familiar paths, thick with towering pines, tangled undergrowth, and shadowed ravines where sunlight barely reached the ground. Even experienced woodsmen hesitated to enter it alone. Generations of settlers had carved farms and roads around its edges, but never through it. Stories circulated of people becoming disoriented within minutes, of hunters who followed animal tracks only to lose all sense of direction, and of sounds at night that could not be explained. Whether these tales were rooted in fear or fact hardly mattered. The forest's reputation was enough to keep most people away. The terrain itself was hostile. Swamps hid beneath layers of leaves, capable of swallowing a man in seconds. Sharp rock formations sliced through the soil, making travel slow and dangerous. During summer, heat and insects overwhelmed the unprepared. In winter, temperatures dropped suddenly, and snow erased every trace of movement. Once inside, escape was not guaranteed. For William, this forest became both enemy and refuge. Its dangers threatened his life daily, yet its isolation also shielded him from the outside world that had already abandoned him. No search parties followed him deep inside. No footsteps came calling his name. The same fear that kept others away sealed his fate and ensured his solitude. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the forest closed around him, reshaping him. It was here, in a place no one dared to enter, that a child was forced to grow up alone, guided only by instinct, memory, and the relentless will to survive. When William Robinson realized no one was coming, he faced a truth no child should ever have to understand. Survival depended entirely on himself. He had no knife, no fire starter, no shelter, only his hands, his memory, and instincts sharpened by fear. Every decision became a matter of life or death. At first, William relied on what he remembered from watching adults. He broke branches using stones, shaping crude tools by striking rock against rock until sharp edges formed. These jagged pieces became his knives, his scrapers, his only defense. With trial and error, he learned which wood snapped cleanly and which bent uselessly in his grip. Shelter came next. Using fallen limbs and thick leaves, William constructed low, hidden nests against tree roots and rock faces. He chose spots that blocked wind and masked his scent from animals. These shelters were never permanent. Storms destroyed them, animals claimed them, but rebuilding became routine. Each failure taught him something new. Fire was the hardest lesson. Without matches, William experimented endlessly, rubbing dry sticks together, striking stones, protecting weak sparks from the wind. Many nights passed in darkness and cold before success. When he finally coaxed a flame to life, it changed everything. Warmth, cooked food, protection, and light became possible. Perhaps most remarkable was his ability to adapt mentally. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear could have broken him, but William learned patience. He watched the forest, memorized animal behavior, and moved quietly. Mistakes were punished immediately, cuts became infections, falls became injuries, but he endured. Over time, the forest stopped seeing him as prey. William blended into it, a child surviving without tools, without guidance, and without mercy, proving that human instinct, when pushed to its limit, can become something terrifyingly powerful. Hunger became William Robinson's most constant enemy. In the beginning, It was sharp and unbearable, a pain that twisted his stomach and clouded his thoughts. Without regular meals, his body weakened quickly, and every failed attempt to find food brought him closer to collapse. The forest offered life, but only to those who understood its rules. William started by foraging, relying on faint memories of what elders had warned him about. He learned to identify edible berries by watching birds and animals, noting which plants were eaten without harm and which were avoided. Mistakes were dangerous. Once, after consuming unfamiliar roots, he fell violently ill, vomiting and shaking for hours. That lesson nearly cost him his life, and he never forgot it. As days turned into months, William grew more daring. He fashioned simple traps using bent branches, vines, and sharpened sticks. Small animals, rabbits, birds, and rodents became his primary source of protein. Catching them required patience and silence. Sometimes he waited all day for nothing. Other times, a single successful trap meant survival for another week. Water sources dictated where he lived. Streams provided fish, but catching them with bare hands demanded speed and precision. During winter, frozen water forced him to break ice with stones, risking injury with every strike. There were times when thirst, not hunger, pushed him to desperation. Food was never guaranteed. There were long stretches when William survived on insects, tree bark, and whatever scraps he could find. Hunger reshaped him, stripping away childhood softness and replacing it with ruthless efficiency. Every bite was earned. Every meal was uncertain. In this hostile wilderness, eating was not comfort, it was strategy. And for 1,000 days, William Robinson learned that survival meant understanding the forest well enough to take from it without being destroyed in return. The forest did not stay the same, and neither did the dangers William Robinson faced. As the seasons changed, survival became a constant battle against nature itself. Each shift in weather brought new threats, and without warning, the forest that once fed him could just as easily kill him. Summer was brutal. Heat pressed down through the trees, insects swarmed relentlessly, and dehydration became a daily fear. William learned to travel early in the morning and late in the evening, hiding during the hottest hours. Mosquito bites festered, and infections spread easily without treatment. Still, summer at least offered food, berries, small animals, and flowing streams. Autumn brought deception. The forest looked generous, filled with fallen fruit and migrating animals, but storms arrived suddenly. Cold rains soaked his shelters, rotting leaves and collapsing roofs. William gathered obsessively, storing whatever he could, knowing that abundance was temporary. Winter was the true enemy. Temperatures dropped sharply, and snow erased familiar landmarks, making navigation nearly impossible. Food vanished. Traps froze. Streams hardened into ice. William survived by burning fires sparingly, wrapping himself in layers of leaves and animal skins, and staying hidden from the wind. Some nights, the cold was so severe he feared sleep, knowing he might never wake. Spring returned life, but also danger. Flooded streams swept away shelters, and weakened trees collapsed without warning. William had to relearn the forest every year, adapting again and again. Living through extreme seasons alone hardened him. Time stopped being measured in days and became measured in survival. Each season he endured was another victory against a world that had already given up on him. The forest was never empty. From the moment William Robinson stepped beyond the last familiar path, he was surrounded by creatures far stronger, faster, and more at home than he was. Every sound in the darkness carried meaning, some harmless, others deadly. At first, fear controlled him. The snap of a twig could send him running, heart pounding, convinced a predator was nearby. Wolves, wild dogs, and large cats were rumored to roam the deeper woods, and whether all those stories were true no longer mattered. One wrong move could end his life. William quickly learned that animals followed patterns. He watched from hiding, studying when they drank, where they traveled, and how they reacted to human scent. He avoided nesting areas and learned to read warning signs. Silence, circling birds, sudden stillness. Fire became his greatest protection. Even small flames kept many predators at a distance. Not all encounters were hostile. Deer froze and stared before fleeing. Birds became messengers, their sudden flight signaling danger. Smaller animals often approached his shelters at night, forcing him to relocate to avoid drawing attention. There were close calls. Once, William awoke to heavy breathing just beyond the edge of his firelight. Another time, claw marks appeared near a food cache he had hidden days earlier. Each encounter reinforced one rule: the forest did not care that he was a child. Over time, William stopped seeing animals as monsters and began seeing them as neighbors, dangerous ones, but predictable. Survival meant respect, caution, and constant awareness. In the wild, fear never vanished. It simply became useful. Physical survival was only half of William Robinson's struggle. The deeper damage came from silence. Days passed without hearing a human voice, without laughter, without reassurance that he still belonged to the world beyond the trees. Isolation began to press on his mind in ways hunger never could. At first, William talked to himself to stay sane, whispering thoughts, repeating memories, even scolding himself out loud just to hear sound. As months passed, those conversations became longer and more vivid. He replayed moments from his past, imagined faces, and created routines to anchor time. Without them, days blended together into an endless blur. Loneliness warped perception. Shadows looked like figures. Wind in the branches sounded like footsteps calling his name. At night, fear intensified, and sleep came in fragments. William learned to stay half awake, listening, always listening. True rest became rare. The absence of human connection also changed how he understood himself. Childhood innocence faded, trust disappeared. William became cautious, emotionally guarded, and alert to every change in his surroundings. He learned not to hope, because hope made disappointment unbearable. Yet isolation also sharpened his mind. He developed discipline, patience, and an intense awareness of cause and effect. Mistakes were remembered vividly because they hurt. Successes, however small, became sources of quiet pride. By the time William had spent years alone, the forest was no longer just a place. It was his entire world. And while it kept him alive, it also reshaped him in ways no rescue could ever fully undo. Even as William Robinson struggled to survive in the dense, remote forest, whispers about his fate began to circulate among nearby communities. People were fascinated and terrified by the idea of a child living alone for so long, and over time, fact and fiction merged into legend. Locals told stories of the forest boy, a nameless child who could vanish into the trees at will. Some claimed he had been taken by the spirits of the forest, blessed or cursed, with unnatural skills that allowed him to live without food or water for weeks. Others insisted he could talk to animals, reading their movements and sounds like a secret language no human could understand. Fear amplified the rumors. Parents warned their children not to wander near the forest's edge, telling tales of a wild boy who would appear from the shadows, eyes glowing, silent as a ghost. Hunters and travelers reported fleeting glimpses of a small figure darting between trees, though none could catch him. Each sighting added to the mystery and reinforced the forest's reputation as a dangerous, almost magical place. Some stories were darker. A few whispered that William had been claimed by the wilderness itself, transformed into something inhuman by isolation, hunger, and the forest's harsh lessons. The truth of a terrified, resourceful boy fighting for his life was lost beneath these imaginative accounts, leaving only fear and fascination. By the time he was discovered, William Robinson had already entered the realm of legend. People remembered the story less as a record of survival and more as a cautionary tale, a mysterious boy who conquered the forest alone, proving both the fragility and the resilience of human life. After nearly 1,000 days alone in the forest, William Robinson's life changed forever, but not immediately. His discovery was accidental, almost cinematic, yet terrifyingly real. Local hunters had ventured deeper than usual, tracking game for the first time in months. When they stumbled upon signs of life, small fires, carefully concealed beneath fallen branches, fresh footprints, and the remnants of traps that no child should have been able to make. At first, they thought they were witnessing a ghost. A small figure appeared between the trees, gaunt, hair long and matted, eyes wide with both fear and caution. William had learned over years of survival that humans could be dangerous, unpredictable, and threatening. He froze, unsure whether to run or fight. Hunger and curiosity both held him in place. The hunters tried to communicate, but William barely understood language anymore in a conventional sense. Months of isolation had left him attuned to sounds, gestures, and survival cues rather than words. Slowly, through patience and small offerings of food, they gained his trust. When William finally stepped out of the forest fully, he was unrecognizable to anyone who had once known him. His body had hardened from starvation and physical labor, his skin tanned and roughened by constant exposure to the elements. He carried the marks of wild animals, cuts, and burns, each a silent story of endurance. Yet beneath the hardened exterior, his eyes held the quiet wisdom and trauma of a child who had lived through a world that had abandoned him. News of his survival spread quickly through the nearby communities. People were astonished. Some called it a miracle, others whispered of supernatural intervention. Few realized the truth that William's survival was not luck. It was the product of instinct, intelligence, and a resilience forged under conditions that would have destroyed almost anyone else. The discovery marked both an end and a beginning. William had emerged from the forest alive, but he had been forever transformed by it, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The world he returned to was not the same one he had left, and he would carry the forest inside him for the rest of his life. Despite the incredible nature of William Robinson's survival, official recognition of his ordeal was surprisingly scarce. At the time, records about black children, especially those from impoverished or marginalized communities, were often incomplete or deliberately ignored. For William, this meant that even after he emerged from the forest, the world that had failed him offered little acknowledgement. Newspapers that did cover the story focused on sensational details, the wild forest boy, or child of the woods, rather than the real human struggle behind his survival. They dramatized sightings, exaggerated dangers, and sometimes suggested mystical explanations, but they rarely documented his true circumstances. 1,000 days alone, building tools, catching food, and evading predators. To the authorities, William's story was not a record of courage. It was an anomaly, inconvenient to the orderly reports of society. Additionally, systemic racism played a major role. Black children's lives were undervalued, and their stories were often dismissed as folklore, rumor, or unworthy of historical record. Even those who knew William personally, neighbors, relatives, and the hunters who found him, rarely had the influence to secure official documentation. Their accounts remained local gossip at best. Privacy may have also played a role. The trauma William endured was profound, and many adults who cared for him may have shielded his story from bureaucrats and journalists, hoping to protect him from exploitation or further scrutiny. In a society already hostile to him, becoming a public curiosity could have been as dangerous as the forest itself. As a result, the official records offer only fragments: his name, approximate age, and the mere mention of disappearance and reappearance. The rest, a daily horror's ingenuity and resilience, was left unrecorded. His story survived through oral history, rumors, and the extraordinary accounts of those who glimpsed his survival firsthand. It remained almost invisible in formal history, a hidden testament to human endurance that only deep research can now uncover. William Robinson's story did not end when he emerged from the forest. In many ways, it continued quietly, unnoticed, tucked into the shadows of history. Unlike the sensationalized wild boy tales in newspapers, the reality of his survival, a black child enduring 1,000 days alone in the wilderness, was remarkable not just for the physical feats, but for the resilience, intelligence, and courage it revealed. Yet, for decades, this story remained largely forgotten. Part of this erasure came from societal neglect. In post-Reconstruction America, the lives of black children were rarely considered historically significant. Stories of survival, innovation, and courage that didn't involve white witnesses or heroes often went unrecorded. William's story existed mostly in whispers, in the memories of hunters, neighbors, and perhaps his own family, but it was never formally celebrated. Still, his impact endured in subtler ways. William demonstrated that survival is not solely about age or size, it is about adaptability, observation, and mental strength. For years, the forest he conquered silently tested anyone who entered, but it could not erase the child who had mastered it. His story, preserved in local lore, inspired those who heard it, a testament to human tenacity against overwhelming odds. William Robinson's survival also challenges modern assumptions about childhood and vulnerability. He became an unwitting symbol of resilience, showing that even a child, underestimated by society and abandoned to the wilderness, could endure extreme conditions with ingenuity and courage. Today, the forest is silent, but William's story whispers through history to those willing to listen. His life reminds us that courage is not always recorded, heroism is not always recognized, and true survival often leaves no formal trace. The boy who lived 1,000 days alone in a forgotten forest became a living testament to human strength, and yet history almost let him vanish entirely.